tell me, Robert, how do you feel about? I'm sure you're a dedicated researcher. Are you willing to take this research back not only to the Sumerian culture, which seemed to pop up, but even further back to the possibility of extraterrestrial intervention, like the Anunnakis and all of that?
I well, that's a tough one. I mean, I honestly, I'll tell you my biases, which is I'm not. That's not my bias to go that way. I tend to be inclined to look at Earth first. On the other hand, I will say bluntly, if there's good evidence and the evidence points that way, I'm not going to dismiss that. That would go against the grain of what I believe. And ultimately, what I believe is that we have to follow the data. We have to follow the evidence. There's frankly no rational reason why there couldn't have been extraterrestrial intervention. I mean, there's no reason. We are here on Earth. We are intelligent beings. We've reached a certain level of technology. I don't think it's inconceivable that you could also have beings on other planets and other solar systems reaching even higher level of technology and intervening. But on the other hand, I want to be clear that I haven't gone there yet because I have not yet personally been convinced that the evidence needs to go there.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not going to dismiss the possibility either if I am convinced by the evidence.
Okay, so part of your theory is the solar plasma theory, which wiped out previous civilizations. And right now, let's face it, we are so technologically dependent right now on satellites and everything. Even a solar flare could take
Absolutely.
us way back. So
Oh, yeah.
tell me a little bit about this theory.
Yeah. Well, basically, there's a lot of different issues here. One thing, I'm a geologist, and one thing that has always been a problem, and when I was a graduate student at Yale back in the late 70s, early 80s, no one had the answer to how do you have ice ages come and go. They're very sudden changes. And back then, we thought sudden geologically might be centuries or thousands of years. Now we know that the changes, these huge climatic shifts, are even quicker. So, for instance, the last ice age ended about 9,700 BC. That's the best dating. That's the dating I prefer to use, based, and I won't get into why, but based on the geology ice core sediment course. And we know that it basically snapped out the last ice age within 3 years, maybe literally overnight, based on the sediment data. So how do you do that? You can't depend on some kind of gradual climate change, to do it that quickly. There's a lot of evidence now that the sun is unstable. It goes through periods of instability based on isotope data in particular, based on nitrate data, etc. There's a lot of data now that the sun was incredibly unstable at the end of the last ice age, about 12,000, 10 to 12,000 years ago, and seemed to have undergone incredible outbursts, incredible discharges, solar flares, huge coronal mass ejections, what are known as coronal mass ejections, where it gives off particles and gas, charged particles and electromagnetic fields coming out of the sun, and that these hit Earth with incredible magnitude, would have heated up the atmosphere, literally in some cases probably would have been like huge lightning coming down on Earth. This, I believe, was a mechanism that would melt the glaciers very, very quickly, would put a lot of water into the atmosphere, would cause a lot of precipitation, that would cause increased melting, change the climate very, very quickly. It actually would cause erosion, I believe maybe even erosion on the Great Sphinx that I've documented, and at that much earlier age. So much different situation than we see with the relatively stable sun today. And we now know from an astrophysical point of view that stars are very unstable. Our sun is a star, and it goes through periods of stability and instability. What is interesting, and I don't want to be a doomsdayer or someone that says just, unlikely catastrophic scenarios. That's just not my nature. But when we look at solar activity over the last 12,000 years or so, it was incredibly active. The sun was incredibly active and apparently unstable about 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. It went through a more lull, a period of more stability, and in the last 70 or so years, right up to the present day, it is starting to show a lot of the same activity, a lot of the instabilities that we saw 1,000 years ago. And actually, it's interesting to me that just in the last year or so, I have noticed that a lot of people are taking they're really giving a lot of attention to solar activity, even on the national news. You turn on the national news on television, and people are talking about solar flares, the latest large solar flare. And we now, as you mentioned, have a modern society built on electronics, built on electricity, the electrical grid, and a major solar flare, much less anything like we saw at the end of the last ice age, could really be devastating to modern society. And we know this is the case because we had a little inkling of that in 1859. In 1859, there was what's known now as the Carrington event. And the Carrington event was a large solar flare and a coronal mass ejection associated with it. 1859, there's not much electricity in 1859, but there were telegraph lines. There were telegraph lines that were being used with Morse code and that type of thing. When this occurred, the solar flare and coronal mass ejection in 1859, it caused incredible currents to pass through these primitive telegraph lines. It set some of the telegraph stations on fire. People were almost electrocuted. It caused incredible devastation, but only to the telegraph lines because that's essentially all the electricity there was back then. Nowadays, if we had a Carrington level event, you would have massive blackouts for not just days, but potentially. So, I think we have to take these things seriously.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons, I mean, speaking totally as a layman, so straighten me out, if I say something that
Sure.
is different, but it seems like the pyramids were probably built many thousands of years ago, maybe even what we would call the golden age, and there was a lot of effort put into that.
Absolutely.
I mean, whether it was done by slaves or however they did it,
That
was a lot of effort to make a pyramid, and it seems like embedded into the pyramid is signs pointing to this point in time specifically. And it seems like they would only do that. I mean, let's face it, living way back then, I'm sure they had better things to do than to go around building pyramids. There has to be a reason for it. And it seems like one of the reasons was to tell us, look, pay attention to this time in the age.
Yeah, well, I think you also have that with other legends, if we could. I don't want to use the term legend, with other ancient knowledge. Let's put it that way. For instance, the Mayan calendar. That many people have been talking about the Mayan calendar coming to an end, quote unquote, in this year, 2012, December 21st, 2012. A lot of things, ancient traditions, I use that term at the moment, point to this period in time as being significant, as being something important. Let me focus on the Mayans just for a second, because I think that they tie right in with what you were talking about. They had the concept of different suns, more or less different world ages. And this gets back to our concept of yuga cycles that we'll be talking about next month at the conference. But they had periods of world ages. One of them ends at the end of this very year. Others, the previous one ended about 5,000 years earlier, a bit over 5,000 years earlier. This is not dissimilar to the concept of the precessional cycle and things like the age of Pisces, the age of Aquarius. But what's interesting to me as a geologist is that when you start looking at patterns in the actual geological record. For instance, I mentioned ice cores and sediment cores, and you can start looking at climatic patterns, which ultimately tie to the sun and solar instabilities. You see the same periodicity, the same cycles in nature as, for instance, the Mayans or other traditions talk about. So I think this is not coincidental at all. I think that they were very attuned to nature, very attuned to the cosmos around them. And we talked about this earlier today, how the concept of unity, this concept of oneness between all people, but also with nature, I think this is very real for them. And we need to take their traditions, we need to take their prophecies, if I could use that term, very seriously. If we don't, it's to our detriment. So I think there's a lot to learn from the ancient concept of cycles.
Yeah, and the good thing about it is you don't have to totally believe something to take it serious.
Exactly, exactly. Oh, in fact, I'm a great one, I gotta say, and I hope this will come out. I, in some level, don't believe anything, but I take everything seriously, and I want to look at it. And I'm not going to, personally, my view is I don't just buy dogma. I just don't buy what people feed me. I really want to look at the data. I really want to give it a fair shake. So I make
Yeah.
that distinction between believing and being open-minded, really looking at the possibilities, looking at the data, and data includes the traditions of the ancient people.
Yeah, in my book, I came out with definitions, and the definition of belief is pretending like you know something that you don't, and eventually forgetting that you were pretending.
Yeah, I like that. I
Yeah,
like that
we
very
get
much.
so
That's
locked in, and then what happens is when you have a belief, and you know it's not grounded in science or experience, you have a
mm-hmm.
tendency to feel insecure with it, and that insecurity comes out as defensiveness and sometimes
Yeah,
aggression to protect that belief.
exactly, exactly, exactly. And sometimes I think you're right. I find that when people protest too much, as they say, when they hold on to a belief too much, it is because of insecurity. It's not because there's real data or a real basis to support that belief. They feel they have to defend it because they know how weak it ultimately is, whether they know that consciously or that's a subconscious, um, you know, understanding of it.
So it seems like you've done some reading of Edgar Cayce. So
No,
how do you feel about some of his predictions? Didn't he predict that there was a chamber underneath one of the
yeah,
shoulders of the Sphinx?
I got involved with Edgar Cayce on a personal level back in the early 1990s because when I was working on the Sphinx, and in some circles I'm best known for my work on the Sphinx right up to this day. In the early 1990s, was working with John Anthony West, who some people may know, sort of a rogue Egyptologist, and I was brought in initially as a geologist to look at the Sphinx, to look at geological techniques that could date the statue, which there's really no independent Egyptological evidence to date it. And there's no inscriptions that say it was built at such and such a time. And, Egyptologists classically thought it was about 2500 BC. Bringing in my geological expertise, I've been able to demonstrate, and this was 20 years ago now, that the Sphinx, the core body of the Sphinx, goes back to a much, much earlier period. Initially, I thought maybe 5000 BC. Now I'm thinking maybe even the end of the last ice age. But it's much earlier than dynastic Egypt, much earlier than it's supposed to be based on conventional Egyptology, based on conventional historians' point of view. So that gets back to the chamber and Edgar Cayce, because Edgar Cayce, it turns out, suggested that the Sphinx and the pyramids actually go much further back in time than Egyptologists, conventional Egyptologists, acknowledge. He suggested they might go back to 10,000